Chapter 3. Can't Knock the Hustle. For 10 minutes, Daryl had been standing in front of the glass tower in Midtown that housed the triple large offices with his arm outstretched as available cabs whizzed by. He'd rushed out without his coat, and it was too cold to be out here in just a sweatshirt. The cold was the one thing he hated about moving up here from South Carolina. It took damn near till June for the weather to break. Cabs never stopped for him. He knew he should have given himself more time, and he would have if Lamont's cornball assistant hadn't made him wait while she put together some package for him to take to Lamont. "He needs to see it tonight, Daryl," she'd insisted. "Then call the messenger service, girlfriend, 'cause I gots to go." So now he was going to be late, and Lamont wouldn't stand for that. He thought about throwing up the hood of his sweatshirt to cover his cornrows, but that might just make him seem more menacing. He was damned if he did, damned if he didn't. Story of his life. A cab slowed to a stop in front of the building, and Daryl saw the blonde woman passenger handing money to the driver. Daryl crowded the door and tried unsuccessfully to open it. He wasn't going to accept that off-duty shit that these towelhead cabbies always tried to pull. He glanced up the street for a split second, thinking he saw a cute new TLE intern heading up the block, and when he turned back around, the cab was taking off, knocking him off balance and nearly running over his foot. The taxi stopped at the next corner to let the blonde woman out. She walked back toward the building, conspicuously avoiding Daryl's glare. To add insult to injury, Daryl looked down and noticed a smudge on one of his brand new white-on-whites. Oh, hell no! He bent down to inspect the damage to his Nike and decided not to mess with it and risk making it worse than it was. He rose and saw that a white man had hopped into the cab. This was the shit that Lamont needed to see. This was why he had to order cars on the company account. Lamont was always complaining about that, calling it a blatant abuse of company policy. "It's a necessity, yo," had been Daryl's response. When Lamont pointed out that no one else in the office ordered town cars to get around, Daryl decided to drop it. Most of Triple Large's employees were female. Fat Man's own harem. They didn't have to deal with this bullshit. Cabs would stop for them, no problem. And the other guys in the office probably took the subway. Daryl wouldn't know. He didn't socialize with them. He only hung with other industry players on the rise. Though the price of admission to get into Lamont's inner circle was high, he was the only cat in the office who had membership, other than Witchy, who'd waltzed right in just because he discovered a couple of successful groups and stayed there by being the ultimate yes man. To join this elite hip-hop fraternity, for over 2 years, Daryl had been a virtual indentured servant with a round-the-clock list of menial chores to do. It was not uncommon for Lamont to call Daryl at 3 in the morning to tell him his car needed a washing. And he didn't mean wash it at your earliest convenience. It was understood that when Lamont told anyone to do anything, he meant now. But Daryl had made it in, winning some respect along the way for being able to withstand the pressure. Most who thought they could hang disappeared once they found out how much work was required to become part of the crew. But the menial chores and public mockery that used to rain down on him constantly were only intermittent these days. Too bad the other guys who tried to infiltrate the TLE circle couldn't suck it up, because the end rewards were well worth it. Now Daryl was a producer of hit records. Well, one so far. If Say What, the new ridiculous single, hit big, he'd see some serious cash.
This ends side 1 of cassette 1. Please turn to 1, side 2.
So why should I have to take the subway? Daryl wondered spitefully. And why should he have to pay out of his own pocket for using the corporate car service? He considered himself the oil in the Triple Large machine. The other employees were replaceable. He deserved preferential treatment. Even though he was sure he'd soon be making more money than he'd ever dreamed possible, he couldn't roll like he wanted to. Not yet. In preparation for his eventual jump in tax brackets, he had toured some pricey apartments with a real estate broker, telling the woman he was looking for something fly. That bony white bitch had held tight to her purse and kept a pinched little smile on her face the whole time, and all the doormen at the buildings they visited had looked at him like he was some common thug. Or had they? Sometimes he felt like he was becoming paranoid. He had to cut down on the weed. He had noticed that Lamont would be at a party stone-cold sober while everyone around him was drunk or high. And Lamont would be having as much fun as the rest of them, if not more. Fat Man had told him he'd tried everything once. Daryl realized he had to keep his mind right if he was going to make it to the top. But he was so out of his element rolling with Lamont, who could talk shit with street niggas one minute and take a meeting in a boardroom on Madison Avenue the next. Lamont, who'd commit fouls that no one had the guts to call during his pickup b-ball games at his Hampton spread, then head into town for his favorite snack, bagels and lox. The regular pickup players were Lamont's big money networking pals. Some were white, some were black, and there was one Asian internet gazillionaire who looked like a college freshman and dressed like one too. They all had two things in common. None could ball, and they were all self-important dicks. They followed Lamont's cue and treated Daryl like gum stuck to the bottom of their sneakers, never inviting him to the post-game chow-downs. For the longest time, he'd thought it was bagels and lox, and he couldn't figure out what that meant. Then one weekend he was sent to Twice Upon a Bagel to pick up Lamont's lunch, and the secret of the lox was unlocked. Daryl wished he had Lamont's social dexterity, but having grown up in a trailer, drinking Kool-Aid out of old peanut butter jars, it was a difficult quality to master. When Dickie, his childhood friend turned rap star, had brought him up to New York close to 3 years ago, it was like being called up from the minors. At the time, Daryl's most treasured possession had been a 14-karat gold Mickey Mouse pendant, and he'd worn his hair in sloppy braids that made him look like Seeley from The Color Purple. He thought he was fly, but Dickie, who'd always had an innate sense of cool, disabused him of that notion. Dickie took him shopping for all the proper hip-hop gear. Throwback jerseys, fitted baseball caps, jeans and sweatsuits by Sean John, academics and Rockaware, and the newest kicks. Now that he had worked his way into the Triple Large crew, things were looking up. But not far enough. Daryl threw up the hood of his Fat Farm sweatshirt and shoved his balled fists into its front pocket. Keeping Imani's package tucked firmly under one arm, he headed for the nearest subway station, cursing under his breath the whole way. Mimi walked out of the hotel, and a cab stopped for her right away. "Hey, where you going?" She turned around to find Kenny standing by the hotel entrance, sucking on a Newport in the chilly air. He'd just returned from having a lap dance at Stilettos in Times Square. "To meet a friend?" she stammered, opening the taxi door. He squinted at her. "What friend?" "Go upstairs," Mimi said without meeting his gaze. "They'll tell you. I'll be back soon." She slammed the door and the driver asked her where she wanted to go. 86 Walker Street, she said, glancing toward the entrance of the hotel. Kenny stubbed out his cigarette and looked back at her. He held his hand up to his ear in a gesture that she instantly knew meant, "Did they call?" As the driver pulled off, Mimi shook her head and averted her eyes, mouthing the word, "No." A bead of sweat rushed down Lamont's forehead. He wriggled his nose and picked up his pace on the treadmill, his eyes glued to the 3 flat screens hanging on the wall in front of him. The televisions were a recent installation. Lamont hated flipping back and forth between channels. He might miss something. The TVs were tuned, as always, to BET, MTV, and CNN. He tried to catch Moneyline with Lou Dobbs whenever he could. Lamont's personal motto was, "If it don't make dollars, it don't make sense." The 3 screens were like his own customized stock ticker flickering with cultural currency. He pounded the conveyor belt until his white Nike t-shirt was clinging to his damp, protruding belly. He cut off the treadmill, stepped down, and grabbed a bottle of Dasani from the refrigerator in the small upstairs bar. Guzzling the ice-cold water, he snatched a fluffy white towel from the basket next to the massage table and stepped out onto his terrace to cool off for a minute. Taking in the panoramic view, he savored a momentary feeling of satisfaction. This deck had more square footage than the entire apartment where he had grown up in the Marcy projects in Bed-Stuy. He looked out and spotted the Brooklyn Watchtower. He hadn't been over to the old neighborhood in a while. Not since he'd convinced his father to move to an upscale retirement community in Florida. The warm weather was better for his father's chronic joint problems. Lamont Sr. called the records his son produced jump-up music. Every time you see one of these videos, they're always hopping around like jumping beans. Can't none of those kids stay still? A civil servant for 39 years, Lamont Sr. would often preach, "A man can make good money, but all that money can't make him a good man." Simply saying, "I'm proud of you, son," wasn't his father's way. Lamont's beloved mother picked up the slack with a pride in her eldest son that bordered on idolatry. Now that Pops was living in Florida and Mama had her own luxurious condo uptown, there was no need for him ever to go back to the old hood. Manhattan was Lamont's hood now. He stepped back inside, whipped off his t-shirt, and tossed it in the laundry hamper, which could have been more accurately described as a trash can. His obsession with cleanliness, bordering on neurosis, meant he wore his gym clothes one time only. His housekeeper had orders to dispose of the clothing she found in the gym hamper. He lay down on the exercise mat and bent his legs at the knees. Time for crunches. He liked to do this part of the workout shirtless, so he could keep an eye on his midsection. He had always been a bear of a man, 6 feet of solid, masculine bulk with shoulders worthy of the NFL, firm and toned. But in the last year or two, his arms had gotten a little flabby, and his midsection had expanded to unacceptable dimensions. He knew it wasn't solely due to an overindulgence of his wicked sweet tooth. He'd never had to work this hard to stay in shape in his 20s, or even in the earlier half of his 30s. He couldn't believe he was almost 40 years old. Playing basketball had always been workout enough to keep him in shape, but not anymore. He clasped his hands behind his head and strained to raise his upper body. The first one was always the hardest. He felt like quitting after 50 reps, but he soldiered on to complete the full 300, hating every damn one. He had no choice. That old man gut had to go. When the cab pulled up at the address Daryl had given her, Mimi looked in her bag for money. Daryl appeared out of nowhere and yanked the door open. "You late." He aggressively greeted her, handing a $10 bill to the driver. He sounded out of breath. "Sorry," she said, as Daryl hustled her past the doorman, through the lobby, and into the elevator of what looked like an expensive hotel. "Lamont don't like folks to be late," he said, fingering one of his cornrows, which had come loose at the bottom. "So is that where we're going?" Mimi wondered. "To see Lamont?" Daryl rushed down the carpeted hallway like a harried traveler desperate to make a connecting flight. Mimi glimpsed at his blotchy reddish-brown complexion and wondered if he had some kind of skin disease. He didn't say another word to her until they reached the last door on the hall. It was already ajar, so he didn't bother to knock. Before they crossed the threshold, he turned to Mimi and asked, "Ready?" That scared her. Ready for what? But she nodded, anxious to hear whatever Lamont Jackson had to say. Chapter 4. Hypnotize. "Monte!" Daryl bellowed into the cavernous apartment. Getting no reply, he dashed upstairs. Mimi took a seat on the small sofa at the end of the entrance hall and removed her poncho. This apartment has stairs, she marveled to herself. A few minutes later, Daryl returned. "Go up and wait in the living room," he instructed her. He'll be right out." Mimi had thought she was in the living room. She began to head upstairs when Daryl hollered after her, "Shoes!" He pointed to the shoes lined up neatly by the front door and said, "Lamont don't like dirt." He was lucky that Lamont had been in the shower just now and hadn't caught him upstairs with his sneakers on. "And hey," Daryl said, "don't be touching him, grabbing him or nothing, all right?" That struck Mimi as odd. Why would she want to grab Lamont? Seeing her puzzled expression, Daryl explained, "Don't be trying to shake his hand or nothing. He got a thing about germs." Mimi nodded, pulled off her scuffed boots, and then walked slowly up the stairs to the main floor of the apartment. It was a massive open space with a wall of glass along one side looking out over the city. The kitchen had not one, but two huge, gleaming refrigerators. The sheer size of the place took her breath away. She was amazed that all this was hidden inside a 6-story building on a quiet city block. It was like opening a door and expecting to see a walk-in closet, but finding a ballroom instead. At the top of the stairs, across from the kitchen, stood a long, massive dining table made from slabs of the most beautiful wood she had ever seen. There was a spiral staircase leading to yet another floor. She wanted to go up and check it out, but Daryl had said to wait here. At the far end of the room there were two huge sofas covered in cream-colored suede, two impossibly large brown leather chairs, an ebony concert grand piano, and a collection of ethnic-looking objects and tiny statues arranged on a low glass coffee table. Everything was expensive-looking, but she wasn't sure if she liked it. Nothing looked like it had ever been touched. She walked over to the fireplace to examine the array of framed photos displayed across the mantel. Lamont with Naomi Campbell, Lamont with Mariah Carey, Lamont with Latrell Sprewell, Lamont with Bill Clinton, Lamont with a white guy she couldn't identify. They were both laughing in the shot, and the other guy's head was tilted so far back it was hard to tell who it might be. She picked it up to get a closer look. "Eminem," Lamont said, walking up behind her. Startled, she quickly set the picture back down in its place. "That was at his last album release party," Lamont explained. "I had just told him he should have called his album Nigga on the Inside." She laughed because she could tell he wanted her to. But standing this close to him made her uneasy. So did being in this apartment. "Have a seat, sweetheart," he said, walking to the kitchen. "Pellegrino, Diet Coke, cranberry juice, Red Bull?" He inquired politely, his face obscured by the heavy stainless steel refrigerator door. Cranberry is good." He filled two huge goblets, one with juice, one with water, and took a seat next to her on the sofa. "This place is really..." She searched for the right word. "Big." "You like it?" "Yeah," she said with more enthusiasm than she felt. "It's really... nice." "Bethany did it," he said. "Bethany?" He'd said the name as if Bethany was some friend of hers. Was that his girlfriend? "Bethany Oglethorpe," he clarified and took a swallow of water. Another weight loss tip from the annoying trainer. Drank gallons of water. "Right," she said, although she had no idea who or what he was talking about. "She's an interior designer," he informed her. "Does all the celebrities." "Right," Mimi repeated, wondering if Lamont considered himself a celebrity. She'd never heard of him until last week. "But do you really like it?" he asked, looking around. He'd bought the place for $3.8 million and paid Bethany an arm and a leg to do it up right. Elegant and masculine had been his only design directives. But did it look weird? Sometimes he walked in late at night, stood in the middle of the living room, and felt like gutting the whole place. Metropolitan Home called the decor eclectic, he said facetiously when she didn't answer. The only reason the wacky, overcharging design diva was worth her fee, in his opinion, was because a Bethany Oglethorpe curated apartment generated press all on its own. Mimi had no idea that Metropolitan Home was the name of a magazine. And did he say electric? She didn't know what he meant by that, so she just smiled. "So, how old are you?" he asked, moving on. "Almost 21. "Almost?" He smiled. Most of the women he knew, and some of the men, were trying to shave a few years off their real ages. Only a kid as young as this one wanted to round up. "I'm not going to card you." Mimi managed to smile, though every word that came out of his mouth made her feel more uncomfortable. But his mouth, she decided, was the most attractive thing about his dark chocolate face. He had full, sexy lips. The rest of his face was kind of flat, like someone had smashed it in and it had never bounced back. His close-cropped hair was going gray at the temples, and before he slouched down on the sofa, was this real suede? She detected a tummy jiggling under his t-shirt. "So is Mimi short for something?" "Marie," she said. Lamont fixed his gaze on her. She really was a beauty. Compared to the other girls in her group, she was practically a supermodel. "Actually, it's Marie-Jean," she began to babble. Why wasn't he saying anything? Coming here alone might have been a mistake. She should have brought Kenny. With a hyphen, you know. Lamont crossed his arms and began having visions of what she could be. At first, he had thought their audition was going to be another next situation, like the 20 or so groups that had come before them. But when Mimi sang her solo verse, it was like the other two girls had disappeared. And then it came to him in a moment of divine inspiration. He didn't need a girl group. He just needed one girl he could mold into a pop superstar. And when he accomplished that, the Augusta job was going to be his. No one called him a one-trick pony. "But everyone calls me Mimi," she continued, waiting for him to speak. "But you already know that, right? So, Marie-Jean was my father's mother's name. My dad was Haitian." Lamont continued to stare at her. Would her hair look decent if she shook out those mousy brown curls? He liked what he saw otherwise. The café au lait skin, the long legs, and yum, those juicy lips that had a natural rosiness. Her dark sweater, which looked like it needed a serious dry cleaning, made it hard to determine if she had anything going on up top, and her baggy pants made it hard to see what was going on from behind. She was almost 5'9", he guessed. As a connoisseur of models, he could determine a woman's height within an inch at a glance. "Let your hair down," Lamont commanded. Mimi blinked several times. "What?" "Let me see what you look like with your hair down," Lamont said with some irritation, because he didn't like to repeat himself. It wasted time. Mimi tugged the band out of her hair and shook her curls out. "Okay," Lamont said neutrally, throwing his feet up on the ottoman. "So, sweetheart, this group you're in is called—" Before she could reply, his attention turned to something buzzing in the pocket of his gray cashmere sweats. He pulled out a cell phone, looked at the caller ID screen, and tossed it onto the table. "Heart Song," Mimi answered brightly. Lamont smirked. "Your manager come up with that?" "No," she said, slightly offended. "I did." "And you're proud of that, I can see." "Well, we want to sing songs that, mean something," she said, trying to read his manner to decide what she should say next. "I can do this," she told herself. "Songs from the heart," she continued, as full of herself as she could manage. "We don't want to be singers who just look good. We want to touch people with our music." "Touch people," he said, and let out a noise that sounded like he couldn't decide whether to sigh or laugh. "Honey, you can't touch people." This time he spit out the word touch as if it were a piece of lint stuck on his tongue. "Unless they hear your music. And people won't hear your heart songs unless they buy your record, which no one will do if they don't hear your songs playing on the radio first. And you won't get any radio airplay if you can't steal the programmer's attention away from the 50 other singles that come their way every week. And even if your songs are on the radio every hour on the hour, people won't be interested in laying out their hard-earned cash for your album if they aren't interested in you. So don't turn your nose up at looking good, baby, because at this moment, looking good is your best asset." Though struck by his cold assessment, she managed to say, "Really? I thought my voice was." Her naivete amused him. Neck and neck, I'd say. He looked down and noticed a hole in the heel of her sock. Mimi noticed him noticing, his brow creasing as if he could not understand how someone could actually be walking around in the world with holey socks. He probably had socks that cost more than her boots. I think you look spectacular today, Lamont said sweetly, leaning over to pat her hand gently as she repositioned her foot to hide the offending hole. After Daryl's stern warning, she instinctively pulled her hand away at his touch. She thought he looked momentarily offended. That shit you had on yesterday was booty. Looked like something you bought on sale at Target. No one in Toledo used the term booty, but she could tell he meant it was tired, tacky, or something along those lines. She thought so too, but Kenny had insisted. Is Jean your last name? Another phone rang, and she paused, thinking he might get up to answer it. He didn't move an inch or glance away, and it stopped ringing. No, she said. My full name is Marie-Jean Castiglione. As she pronounced her last name, he looked like he had just gotten wind of a foul odor. Damn, baby, that is a mouthful. That sounds like some mafia shit. His cell phone started vibrating on the table. Again, he looked at the caller ID, but did not pick up. Good, Mimi thought. Pay attention to me. He was going to offer them a deal. She could feel it. Why else would he ask her here and spend this much time? She wished he would just get down to it. I like the name Mimi, he said, almost to himself. But I like Marie-Jean, too. The Haitian thing. He silently considered all this as the house phone began ringing again. He looked over, idly watching 4 of the 6 lines flashing like Christmas lights. After the 3rd ring, Lamont's placid facial expression changed abruptly. Answer the motherfucking phone! He roared, in a tone so harsh that Mimi actually leaned away. The phone stopped ringing. Damn, I got it! Daryl shouted from downstairs seconds later. Got 3 lines going. It's Imani, want it? No, Lamont boomed. I'll hit her back in a minute. He looked directly at Mimi, and in a soft voice that Daryl couldn't possibly hear, said, I'm in an important meeting. He stared at her, then broke out into a wide grin. Well, Mimi, he said, welcome to the Triple Large family. He stretched his hand out in her direction. She didn't take it. She instinctively put her hands up to her face, shaking with excitement. You mean we're signed? You want us? We? He snapped. I don't see any we in here. What do you mean? She sputtered, eyes wide. I thought you called me because you didn't like Kenny, our manager. You're right, I don't like Kenny. We don't either, she stammered. Not really, but he was the only person we knew in Toledo. She began jabbering faster and faster, and Lamont just let her go. I mean, I'm the lead. I can make decisions, and we can get rid of Kenny. I know he's an amateur. And so are your 2 little friends, Lamont said smoothly. I'm signing you, Mimi, as a solo artist. You have the voice. You have the look. You have it. They don't. Forget them. She was dumbstruck. He slid closer to her on the sofa. She smelled sweet and clean, like a mixture of Dove soap and licorice, and he felt a stirring in his groin. Now, he commanded as if contracts had already been signed. We have a company apartment. You'll stay there. It's completely furnished. If you want, you can move in tomorrow and send for your things. Or you can go home, get everything settled, and we can wait until next week. She looked down at her unpolished, bitten to the quick fingernails. She hadn't heard a thing he'd said since forget them. Forget Toya and Keisha? How could she do that? Talk to me, he said evenly. She didn't know what to say. You want a contract, don't you? Yes, she said softly, but for the group. She looked at him pleadingly, moistness rimming her brown eyes. I know they're your friends, honey, he said soothingly, but they aren't as talented as you. It might sound harsh, but this is a harsh business. If you want to do this, and I can see that you do, you have to recognize that. Mimi inhaled sharply. She felt like he could see her heart beating. He was right. She did have the best voice. They all knew that, but that was why she was the lead. Doing this without Toya and Keisha had never entered her mind. They were a group. Sensing he was making headway, Lamont pulled out the line that worked like a charm with every woman he'd ever wanted to get into bed. "You're special," he cooed, pausing to let the words take effect. "Talented." Another pause. "And beautiful." She was flattered, but she heard herself saying, "I can't." The words sounded lame, even to her. She couldn't even imagine going solo. It would be like shedding her security blanket, and she was not ready to do that. And Toya and Keisha would be devastated. She couldn't do it. She wouldn't. "What a shame," Lamont said, his friendly tone cooling. She would come around, but he didn't have all day to play guidance counselor to this child. He had a massage scheduled for 6. "They're my best friends," she said, flushing with anger. If he was so tough, why couldn't he tell Toya and Keisha to their faces that he didn't want them? Lamont wanted to tell her how many times the supposed best friend of some girl he was fucking tried to give him some pussy on the sly. And that chunky girl with the braids, Lucretia, Laquifa, or whatever, she had hoe written all over her. He was quite certain that if she had been called for a meeting here today, she would have sucked his dick and swallowed if she thought it would earn her a solo deal. He'd received oral favors for a lot less. "I know for a fact," he said sharply, "that if either of those girls were here in your place right now, they would jump at this chance and never look back." Mimi smirked. He knew that for a fact, did he? Toya and Keisha would never dump her to take a solo deal. Would they? "But it's just that—" Mimi began, unsure of what she wanted to say. Lamont looked at her expectantly. He knew she'd be thanking him later for advising her to drop the dead weight. Right now, however, he had an overwhelming urge to strangle her. Was she really so naive as to throw away a solo deal in order to spare the feelings of 2 no-talents, just because they all used to jump double dutch together? "And what do I say when they find out I got a deal without them?" she said as defiantly as she could. Without her, there was no group. How could she ever face them? "Hey, that's on you," he said. "Maybe they can do background vocals." He stood up. Mimi remained seated, her jaw firmly set. "You're not going to get a deal somewhere else," he said, sensing she might be trying to come up with alternatives to his proposal. "Not with those other 2 girls hanging around your neck like cement blocks." He loomed over her, speaking with a stinging finality. "Maybe that fake-ass manager told you different, but I'm telling you the truth." Mimi knew his assessment of Kenny's managerial skills was dead on. Kenny didn't have much juice. "Did he have other labels interested?" Lamont asked, 100% sure that the fake-ass manager did not. "I'm not sure," she said, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "He might." "He doesn't," Lamont snapped. "Truth is, I could pull 2 girls at random off the street who look as good as those other 2, and they'd probably sound better." Mimi shot him a wounded glare on behalf of her girls. God, he was awful. How could he talk like that about Keisha and Toya? They were cute enough, and their voices were good, if not great. Lamont stood over her, wondering if this girl was ever going to come around. The meeting was over. He helped her up, wordlessly leading her downstairs, where Daryl was manning the phones. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 3 minutes past 6. Where was his masseuse? "I have to think about it," Mimi said shakily. This couldn't be happening. Not this way. It was supposed to be the 3 of them, together. "Great," Lamont said easily. "You have till tomorrow." He stepped close enough to speak to her without Daryl's overhearing. "Mimi, listen to me," he murmured. He put both of his hands on her cheeks and stooped a little to look directly into her eyes. "Toledo is no place for a girl like you. You're golden, honey. And you don't even know it. This is the way it has to be. Trust me. He kissed her on the forehead. I'm a star maker, baby, he said with a huge grin. And believe me, you are going to be a star. Corniest line in the world, but that was the kind of Hollywood movie bullshit that he knew she wanted to hear. Hey, congrats, Daryl called out, hurrying down the hallway after Mimi, her bag on his shoulder and her poncho and boots in his arms. She'd forgotten everything, wandering out into the hall like a sleepwalker. You can call me Daryl, but my peeps just call me Country D 'cause I'm from down south, he said. The elevator doors opened and she seemed to float inside. Mimi, that's a hot name, he continued, following her. I groom act, so I got a big say when it comes to details like that. Names and shit. I produce, too. Mimi did not respond. Daryl was beginning to think she was deliberately ignoring him. She'd had plenty to say to Lamont, the big boss man, but she couldn't say shit to him. The minute you get a deal, you turn into a diva, huh? Who'd listened to her group's crude demo? Him. Who'd brought it to Lamont's attention? Country D. If it wasn't for him, she wouldn't even be here. Arriving downstairs, she hurried out of the elevator, but the coolness of the lobby tile startled her back to reality. She turned around just as Daryl dropped her boots, bag, and poncho to the elevator floor. Daryl strode through the lobby thinking, if this uppity chick thinks I'm going to play houseboy to her Cinderella, she's out of her pretty little head. He walked out to Lamont's Suburban, with the 3 large license plate, which was idling by the curb. After pulling on her boots in the lobby, Mimi followed. Yo, shoot her up to the Chesterfield on 37th, Daryl said, rousing Carlos from his catnap. And be back by 8 to get Monty for dinner. The Chesterfield, Carlos muttered. Where's that? On 37th, nigga. Daryl was simmering. Lamont never let him floss around town in his whip. I'll call you tomorrow to touch base, Daryl said gruffly and turned to head back into the building, leaving Mimi to struggle with the door. Daryl knew Carlos, a quiet man with menacing eyes, never performed any official chauffeur duties. He was just a 36-year-old b-boy on parole whose full-time job was safely shuttling Lamont around town. Mimi slid onto the seat, a grim look on her pretty face. The back windows were half open, and the crisp air felt good. Raising her pouty lips up to the opening in the window, she called out, Country D. Oh, the princess had something to say. At least she had addressed him correctly. He'd come up with the nickname Country D a few months ago, but it didn't seem to be catching on at the office. Yeah? He huffed, hoping she wasn't going to hit him up for some cash. Money matters had to go through Lamont. Thank you, she said quietly. No worries, baby. Daryl managed to say nonchalantly, though he was caught off guard by the genuineness of her tone. Thank you? No one he worked with ever said that to him, unless they were being sarcastic. The Suburban took off and Mimi settled back, thrilled and panicked, Toya's words spinning in her head. Maybe we're gonna get signed, and maybe we're gonna move here, and maybe we're gonna be famous. Maybe. But how could she tell them that? As far as Lamont was concerned, there was no more we. Chapter 5.